many of you were here at the last restorative justice session that we had with Joe. But it was a very informative session. Joe went through an awful lot of very interesting detail around restorative justice, different types of restorative justice and limitations. And I think afterwards we had a conversation and realised that actually that was only really the start of the conversation. So this is why we decided today would be another session where we could literally have the conversation. So we have a facilitator at each table, and there's a scenario, but before we actually get down to doing a bit of work, Joe's just going to give us a refresher on his talk, and then we're going to get down to some serious talking, and then we are going to have feedback at the end. So we want full participation today, please, and feel free to share what it is you think or your ideas or thoughts, because I think Joe's very interested to hear other perspectives. You know, don't feel like you don't maybe know what this is. I think everybody has an idea in their own minds what restorative justice means to them. So it's okay to articulate what you think it means, because I think that's what Joe wants to hear today. So without further ado, and less of my chat, I'll hand over to Joe.
And I think that Susan put it correctly. In addition to not being afraid because you don't know what this thing is, remind you that the kind of the point of the first talk that I gave was that nobody knows what this thing is. So you're not alone there. Let's just introduce the facilitators at each table. We have Owen Donnelly at the front, either Seamus or Maureen at that table over there. You have Roshan in the back. You have Eamon Baker there, and Susan will do it here. Hopefully they don't have to do much and just can be an active participant in the discussion as well. Let's see. I think almost everybody was here the last time, so I'll just go back over this very, very briefly just to start. So if you remember, we looked, basically the point of my talk was that we crawled through a whole host of academic and anecdotal and research looking for some sort of idea of what this thing, restorative justice, is. And at the end, we were left with far more questions than answers, right? We were left with these sort of questions here that I talked about last time. These have to do with, well, is it a philosophy or is it a set of practices? Is it a means-based approach like mediation, or is it an outcome-based approach, right? And we had different scholars saying different things. What's the scope of a restorative justice intervention, right? Maybe it can heal or reintegrate individuals, but can it make a difference for the type of communities that we live in on a larger scale? And what sorts of crimes? We talked about this before, and especially in light of the news that we all are aware of and that will probably come up at some point. What is restorative justice something that can be used to address murder, rape, sexual assault, grievous bodily harm? Up until this point, as you probably know, restorative justice has primarily been used with nonviolent or property type crimes. But there's a lot of people who argue that maybe it's time to start scaling it up. And especially in Northern Ireland, what role for state institutions? Is restorative justice completely outside of the purview of the state? Is it a radical challenge to existing power arrangements? Or is it something that needs to be integrated with that? What role can the state play? What role can the police play? What role can the prosecutors and judges and other organs of justice play? And we suggested that without answering these questions, this is it's an Alice in Wonderland concept, basically, where anybody can say, I'm doing restorative justice, and that provides them with sort of the legitimation to then do really whatever they want or whatever their group wants. Okay, and this is a problem. It prevents restorative justice from developing means of accountability, and it prevents it from developing any sort of comprehensive theory about what it can or cannot accomplish. So that was by and large the points that I argued last time, and the points that we make in the paper. And again, just to call attention to what the discrepancy in all these 20 years of voluminous research on restorative justice, we've only been able to agree on 3 major, very vague and general principles, right? That crime is a harm and that people are the victims of harm, not the state, or not necessarily the state. And that offenders, people who have perpetrated harm on others, have the responsibility or have obligations to correct that harm, and that both the victims and offenders are stakeholders. But who else is a stakeholder, right? Who else needs to be at a restorative justice intervention or table? These are some questions that we'll be dealing with in the scenario I present. And so what we argued eventually is that at this moment, without the work of people like yourselves and scholars elsewhere, restorative justice is functioning really as kind of a buzzword. A buzzword is something that is a concept that's unmoored from any sort of coherent theoretical foundation, right? And paradoxically, people either take discursive or take dialogic recourse to restorative justice simply because they understand on some level that it's a good thing to do, right? But just doing something because it's a good thing to do, supposedly, is not a way towards, I argue, a way towards actually making a difference in the world in which we live, okay? And at the end, as you remember, the main point of our paper was to develop this sort of typology. We looked through all this stuff and we said, look, there's really 4 major strands of restorative justice theory, and each one is geared towards different groups, and each one has different associated practices, right? We had what we called the reintegrative strand that focused on offenders. It focused with reintegrating the people who commit harm into the communities in which they live and not subjecting them to more pain and more harm in the form of punitive incarceration. Psychotherapeutic strand that says that the victims are the ones that need healing, that need justice. Yet a communitarian strand that suggested, well, yes, both of those things are important. What really is important is restoring or perfecting the communities in which we live, and that absent that sort of focus, that no individual or no victim, no perpetrator, no survivor could ever really be reintegrated. And then we had the kind of the radical perspective that saw restorative justice as a fundamental challenge to established systems of power. One that suggests that without radically altering the societies in which we live, the economic, the cultural, the structural injustices that we operate, restorative justice can never be more than just the justice systems of the state gussied up in a different form. That's what that suggests, okay? So that was the recap of my talk last week. Hopefully I did it quickly and not confusingly enough. So I'm going to read out this scenario just because we didn't print out enough for everybody. But this is the scenario I want you all to discuss at your table. You, collectively you, are a youth and or community worker in an interface community in Northern Ireland. You're quite proud of how far your community has come since the signing of the Belfast or the Good Friday Agreement, but your community remains, like most interface communities, severely deprived. People in your community, by and large, lack access to state resources, secure employment, efficient transportation, higher education, and drug and alcohol abuse remain a worrisome problem. Some of your community's young people continue to be attracted by paramilitaries and or other prescribed organizations, but nowhere near to the extent that they would have been 15 years ago. You're developing a closer relationship with the PSNI, and you trust and respect the officers assigned to your area, but many in your community still refuse to engage with the police. So as you can see, this is kind of a bog standard scenario that I've sort of developed in my time here. In general, you feel like your community is making real progress. You're getting better at combating sectarianism. You're removing some of the territorial markers that used to demarcate this is our area and this is not yours. But this particular time, it was a bad summer. Sometime around the bonfires, a group of young people from your neighborhood gathered to drink and crossed the interface and attacked the 2 houses closest to the interface. One, belonging to a pensioner, had its windows broken. The other, belonging to a young family, was firebombed. Thankfully, the family was not home at the time, but the damage to their home was extensive, estimated in the tens of thousands of pounds. You are currently in close conversation with community workers and from across the interface and the PSNI about how you can head off this dangerous situation. Your counterpart from across the interface suggests trying to implement some type of restorative justice. You're intrigued and agree to explore some possibilities with him or with her. The PSNI tells you that they have to check with the Public Prosecution Office, but in theory they are willing to employ restorative cautioning for all the youths who may have committed criminal acts except for those who instigated and carried out the firebombing. Your sense of the youths that committed the vandalism and arson is that by and large they are good kids with real possibilities, but growing up in the neighborhood makes them vulnerable to antisocial agitation. You are also aware that there are 1 or 2 hard cases amongst them who might be past reaching and who probably instigated the firebombing attack. The cross-interface consulting group you recently funded with community leaders from the other community has received an initial grant of £10,000. The grant is intended to aid you in whatever intervention you design and implement. How will you go about it? So for the purposes of this exercise, we talked a bit about coercion last time, but you can assume that a number of young people from each side of the interface and their families have expressed a wish to be a part of this process, okay? So that's one assumption that you can make. Before I set you loose, you'll see this guide also at your table. You don't have to adhere to this, totally, but before your group begins to talk through the scenario, I would like you to think about what you can accomplish potentially with this £10,000. The purpose of doing that is to help you start developing what in fact you think a restorative justice can achieve given the resources you have available to you. And then after you've discussed that a bit, maybe start thinking about what practices you might wish to employ, and more importantly, why. As I write, how will you design and implement the restorative justice intervention, and how will it reflect what you'd like to see accomplished, okay? And then after you'll probably choose one or two members of your group who can then kind of funnel this back to the larger discussion. And this is the part that I like the best, because it's the best for me, but hopefully it's also the best for you. A number of questions are going to come up as you do this. A number of questions. I'd like you to keep track of those questions, because then we can funnel them back into the larger group discussion as we start to talk through some of the limits, some of the possibilities, and some of the remaining questions we have about the possibility of using restorative justice type interventions as a means to combat sectarianism and interface violence and improve cross-community relations. Okay? So before I set you loose, are there any questions on any of this?
How long are you going to have the discussion?
I think that what I'm going to try to give you half an hour, maybe 25 minutes to work through this, and then we'll all come back to the larger group. Okay? And because I'll get bored if I just sit here, I'm probably going to come and sit at one of the tables. All right?
So you can't just do that though without the other. Well, on one side you had the community art project, then that triggered somebody on the other side got their window broken and fired on with it. You can't do one without the other, no you do.
Social workers, community
But I still think you can do something.
Can I ask? Could I maybe go back a little bit? Okay, Charlie, we want to meet we have our meeting.
Can they change their perception?
One suggestion is obviously with the art project. What we did is possibility of
Well, the whole idea of this here is sort of it remains the parents. What I say
Very good no teenagers.
See, I kind of feel I hear that word community. I think it's a long this meeting, it's for people on the internet.
All right, well, I'm fascinated to hear. I don't need to. Oh, that's right. I already have another mic. Huh? Well, I'm fascinated to hear what you've all come up with. Very much so. And I think that just in the service of total randomness, we might start with Roshan's group. Whoever, just a few seconds on summating up what you talked about and heading any insights or ongoing questions. Anybody who wants to go with Roshan's.
Okay, I was just at the point where I was organising the points. But anyway, I'll just go through what we talked about. Some of our questions were, for example, is money the answer? Is money going to solve all of the problems? We weren't sure if money was the answer to a lot of the issues. We also talked about we were assuming ourselves that the young people, we generally tend to think that they might be male, mostly. So we're wondering if there is something that needs to be explored around the male model, sort of strong male role models, and some of the table were pointing out one-parent families, maybe where the father is absent, and maybe teachers also in primary schools tend to be female. So maybe there's something that needs to be explored around that. Sorry, I don't know what's coming to Also, we'd also talked a bit about that the antisocial behaviour can also occur in lots of other cities and towns, and maybe the interface is not just the reason here, that there's other issues that need to be addressed which would be common in other cities. With regard to the money, we felt that it's really important to build a relationship with the young people, and it's almost about trying to find out sort of the background and maybe the family situation of the two ringleaders, that maybe there's a need there for support, social support that maybe young people aren't getting, and that was very important. We also felt that it was important to build a relationship with the young people, and to try and bring the young and the old together, maybe through some intergenerational programme. But we also were very much aware that you have to get the young people in the door and sort of sell this to them in a way that they would be interested. So there's a challenge there as well to do that. We felt the intergenerational work would be beneficial because it would let the younger people be more aware of the older people, and the older people again of the younger people. Maybe we'll break down some of the perceptions that they have of each other. We also felt it would be quite good to maybe have, I think it was one of the models up there, the conference and bringing the victim and offenders together, and that maybe if the teenagers were to hear the impact from the young family and the older people of what actually, of the damage that was done and the impact that it had on them. We also felt it was important that the victims were okay to come and speak, and if they weren't, we were confident that we would be able to find examples elsewhere of people who were victims of similar situations who could come in and tell the young people about the impact that it had on them. We also felt, I suppose, with the young people, you would need to sort of entice them in, so maybe it would be offering them rewards if they took part in a programme, and if they took part eventually in intergenerational work, that there would be something that would encourage them, like say there's going to be pizzas available, there may be movie nights, to try and get them to be interested and to try and reward if they come and take part in the talks and discussions. So to sort of keep them motivated, I think was one of the things. Was there anything else? No? So I suppose we felt that a couple of those models might work. The conference and bringing the victim and the offenders together, and then what was the other one? The story. Yeah, we thought maybe the storytelling might work with intergenerational. If the intergenerational program took off, that the storytelling might work if the young people hear from the older people stories about their past, and there's a connection there between them, that might work. Okay.
Thank you. You're right. Will you pass the mic down over to Amos Group?
Hi Joe. We're realising this is a GC, and like Roisin's group, we're kind of thinking maybe money isn't necessarily the most important thing here. Throwing money at it isn't enough. Although it was suggested that if you provided some new space to bring people out of the area that they were maybe perpetrating these offences in, that that would be helpful. We started off with a bit of a discussion about whether the victim and perpetrator should meet, and we didn't really come to a decision about that, and also about who do you report a crime to. And I think most people felt the police, but there was a feeling too that maybe if it wasn't very serious that you could go directly to a family. Then we started talking about the role of parents, and I think our group generally felt that it was really essential to involve the parents, and it's important to kind of rebuild relationships, not just between the victim and the perpetrator, but to involve the parents in kind of like a restructuring of social relationships. This would be very important. And it seemed important too that there would be an imaginative response. If these are young people who are bored, they're not always necessarily doing it out of malice, but boredom we agree that that's not an excuse for it. But at the same time, if you provide some sort of imaginative solution, and Flavio suggested one there, where he went out and talked to people who had been doing stuff in the area, and they were kind of amazed that somebody would come out and talk to them, I think, you know. And in other cases where something imaginative was done, it did work, you know. So, yeah, imaginative responses, re-socialisation of people into their communities, and sometimes probably within their families, because within families communications have broken down. So reconnect with communities and with nature as well.
Excellent.
And generally your society.
I'm going to suggest that we abandon the microphone and speak just
sorry about that.
for my own and I'm sure everybody else's eardrum.
You keep the mic up to your mouth.
Okay.
Does it? Oh, just that helps. It's still
There's
listening.
little speakers above your head, which is kind of...
Okay. Well,
Okay.
Susan, do you mind grabbing the? Yeah, and your group can go next if you want.
Who wants to feedback? It was interesting because we were talking, people were saying, was money the answer? We never questioned. We said we have £10,000, what are we going to spend it on? So let's just be honest about that from the offset. I think we started off generally talking about how we might spend the £10,000 and suggesting like community festival type events, some kind of an event within the community to restore some community pride. We talked about the harder to engage young people, and then Michael talked a wee bit about the Youth Justice Agency model, where it's the conferencing model. So you have the victim and the offender agreeing to sit around the table and talk about the impact of the crime on the victim, and at some point, is there an apology? So I think basically the victim or the offender has to agree that they've done something wrong to start with, and then you take it from there. And I think in terms of spending the money, we thought we could do quite a lot with £10,000 actually. We could do some kind of an event within the community to involve the young people so that they feel some kind of ownership, but also looking at training trainers to actually deal with why this presumably sectarian attack happened. So if you have people within the community who are trained to deal with this type of event occurrence and they can talk to young people, that might help within the community and it won't necessarily happen again. What else did we talk about? Retribution and punishment. We talked about, sometimes are people looking for blame or revenge, closure and justice. And we had a bit of a conversation around Bloody Sunday, and in that particular scenario around the political authorities potentially could have head that off at the pass, and maybe we wouldn't be where we are now if there had been some acknowledgement from the authorities at the time that there had been something done wrong at the time. Building relationships with young people was important within the community, and let me see what else, Michael.
Yeah, just on the youth conferencing issue, what currently happens is that the young person has an opportunity to meet the victim in the presence of a PSNI diversity officer, a parent guardian, a youth worker, or someone who would be involved in community relationship. And with the agreement of the offender, there's a round table conference, but at the end of the conference there's a plan made, and the plan has to be then taken to the court and agreed by the judge. And the plan could be something like that they could write a letter of apology, that they say they destroyed something down at the cenotaph there, they meet somebody from the Royal British Legion, or if it was a tricolour that was offensive, that maybe going to meet somebody from, say, the AOH, or agree to cut the grass around a church, or agree to cut the grass in the community, or attend an anti-sectarian course, where the impact on the young person then can be transferred back to other young people to prevent them doing other types of offences. That's currently been on the go this last couple of years in the city. And at the meeting that I was at on Tuesday morning. This year, for the first time, there hasn't been one offence of that nature taking place that went through a youth conference agency, but there's been 71 incidents of sectarianism right throughout the whole of the Northwest since April of this year. So those type of offences still going on. So it's just, when we were talking about, we started off about no argument about the spending the money, because the money was needed as far as we were concerned to even do an event. Such as this year is a community event going to happen up outside the interface up there on the 12th and 13th of August, from 12th to 8th, on the 2 days. December, sorry, of August and May. December coming, which is a cross-community event, and we will be thinking if this young person could be that they would work at that event if they were going through a youth conference.
So I suppose we were looking at the victim offender conferencing and also the communitarian model in terms of it's not just about restoring, it's not just about the victim and offender, but it's also about the community as well, and the impact that this type of thing or any type of crime, whatever it might be, actually has on a whole community as opposed to just the people involved.
Great. I'll pass it on to Owen's group real quick. Anyone wants to feedback?
We had come up with a wide range of discussion, not all of which I'm going to remember the feedback. We had a couple of questions, which was particularly, how do people understand restorative justice? Do we ourselves around the table have an understanding of what it is? We looked at a bit of the work locally of the community restorative justice approach, and of the work of Mark Umbright in Minneapolis on the victim offender conferencing. So that question then, how is restorative justice understood, in particular in Northern Ireland, in communities with the police? Also, is it a short-term thing, just for ticking boxes and filling in summer diversionary programs, or can it have a longer-term effect? And what could be the tangible benefits in a community? We agreed with the other groups that the young people need to be involved, that the people who have been the victims need to be involved, need to contribute to any discussion around solutions. Unless anybody in my group wants to add anything else, I think that's...
We had some discussion about bonfires and alternative to bonfires, and I see some of the other groups mention having festivals, and it's something I personally would like to hear more about, why there is a council policy of encouraging alternatives to bonfires, and is it mostly to do with environmental problems, or is there something about the culture around bonfires that tends to lead to sectarian animosity, and events like this case study?
Yeah, basically what my point was, I think things are improving since trouble stopped on the Good Friday Agreement. Young generation is coming with and mixing with. Of course, it will take a bit time. Yeah.
Pass it on to Seamus.
We chose to locate ourselves in the Bishop Street Fountain location, and building on the back of very substantial community relations work that is going on between the two communities there, that we would utilise at least that as much as the £10,000 to see if there was the possibility to utilise that resource of work that is going on, where people are meeting and so on. So the idea we came up with was to arrange a meeting, an invitation to everybody, note into all letterboxes, more or less to the effect, we are working at good relations here, but there was nasty action and reaction, and can we meet to talk about it? That's not therefore going for victims and perpetrators, it's going for total community involvement. Anyway, whoever would then turn up to that meeting, it would be explained up front that there are issues related to what happened over which this meeting has no say, and those have been indicated by the PSNI. That led us to one question. In the scenario, Joe, that you gave, it said the PSNI reserved the right to engage around the issues of bonfire. We wonder if the police would not be required to treat everything, including the breaking of the windows and so on, in the context of hate crime, as being something that they would have to, and therefore that our meeting with the community would have to make it clear that there were strict boundaries to what the community could undertake to do. Okay. Going beyond that, then, it would be, we feel that this meeting should start, after explaining the PSNI legal position, with an opportunity for those who turn up to hear about the damage that has been done. Either from those affected, or, and very often they might not be happy to, from spokespersons of those most directly affected, so that the communities would hear of the damage done. Now, within the constraints of not being able to engage with the legal thing, the question for us at the meeting would be to invite the communities to explore what then are our options. And we felt that we would try at this meeting to get the people there to explore how it might be possible for them to commit to trying to get their young people to turn up. Now, I'm not talking about perpetrators here, I'm talking about young people. Oh, by the way, we were going to have an away from Bishop Street. We were thinking maybe it's in Collins Park House, not in the Short Gateway, as an away from the scene venue for this meeting. And we thought then that we tried to persuade those, we tried to encourage those in attendance to agree to getting the young people to come together, and as I say, not perpetrators, and that they would be invited to come and get a sense of the damage that was done by that action or reaction. We wondered, without being too sure, whether we might start with a single identity thing. You know, the Bishop Street community would try to get a session with their young people, Fountain would do likewise, and then maybe lead to a sharing. Among the things that we thought of would have been the possibility of a cross-community youth engagement in doing a joint art project to replace the one that has been damaged. But anyway, at that point, oh yeah, just one other thing. How would you persuade young people to come? How would the communities persuade their young ones to turn up? Maybe just to make the point that the issues that are at stake here are such that some young people could end up with a criminal record. Is there the possibility that by participating in this, that might be avoided?
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you, Seamus. It's 2 o'clock right now. I would like to stick around and kind of sum up some of what we talked about and maybe offer some of my own perspectives. But if you have to go to work or you have to go somewhere else, I invite you to take this opportunity to take off, and I'll maybe we'll go a bit like 15 minutes over if you have to leave. All right. So what I'd like to do is to sort of to sum up a lot of what I heard, and maybe to talk to you a bit about how some restorative justice theorists have looked at the issues that the groups themselves raised. One of the first and the most I saw Roshan's group, I heard Seamus's group raise is and I believe Michael and Susan's, is the question of incentivization, right? The idea is that why would anybody participate, why would an offender participate in a restorative justice program if it's just another hoop that they have to jump through, right? And we called this is actually known as net widening in the literature. It basically, it's just the idea that restorative justice is just another sort of punitive system of control that gets added on in addition to the criminal justice system. Now, if you think back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, they incentivized participation by taking prosecution off the table if it could be, if you had committed what they called a political crime, right? That was a very big way, but the criticism of that was then that they forestalled a necessary punitive response to justice, right? Unrepentant murderers walked free, right? So that's one kind of very large question of incentivization, right? But the question is as I discussed in the last time before, if you coerce people into restorative justice, the literature suggests that that doesn't work, and you're not going to get good results from that. So it has to be voluntary, but in order to get people to participate, you have to incentivize them to participate. So incentivization becomes a very crucial and interesting question for restorative justice, and it's one that everybody who wants to sort of kind of set one of these practices up has to think about, and I'm glad that the groups raised it. I thought nearly everybody said about the idea of at least the youth themselves. Interestingly enough, there was kind of the victims sort of got lost in a lot of your discussion, the pensioner and the young family, right? There was a lot of talk about making sure that the youths were involved in the planning stages, involving in not only setting up the intervention to deal with this temporal action, but also in setting up something for the youths could participate down the road, whether through sort of community festivals or alternatives to bonfires or something that integrated them back into the structure or the leadership, gave them a role and made them feel like they belonged in their community. And it was thought that by and large this could play an active role in helping to prevent this type of stuff from happening again. That's largely supported in the literature, but again, so it's good that you thought about how the people would be involved in planning for their own sort of interventions. But again, I was very conscious of the fact that not many groups talked about how to involve the victims, the actual victims, the people who didn't firebomb or who had their houses vandalized, right? Another thing that came up was the issue of, this always comes up, is the issue of punishment and blame, right? There's punitive punishment, and then a lot of people like to claim there's restorative punishment. And I think Michael talked a little bit about that, which is that whereas a punitive punishment is incarceration or fines or something like that, or restorative punishment can be things like you have to work for the good of your community, you have to do something out there, you have to do community service or whatnot. But again, it's always helpful, the literature suggests, if you involve the people in planning for their own punishment, right? And this is, as Michael has suggested, restorative conferencing, this is the type of thing that it likes to look at. The offenders themselves suggest what they can do to make it right. The victims suggest what needs to happen for them to feel that it's been made right. And a kind of an appropriate sort of punishment and blame is developed according to those types of dialogic mechanisms. I don't think this, and I mentioned this last week, I think that restorative justice is going to lose kind of all pith if people start to think of it widely as something that takes away the natural right of people to punish people for wrongdoing, right? Because part of that aspect of punishment is to reassert the right order, the moral world, the differences between right and wrong. And while those may be blurred in practice and in theory, for a lot of people it's very important to draw that line between they did wrong and I did not, right? And that's very important for people's mental health and social well-being. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily always have to lock people up. It means we need to start thinking to be more creative about the ways in which we punish. And I thought that the groups were sort of very good about that. Apologies were brought up. That's a huge deal in restorative justice literature. How can you incentivize apologies? Are apologies really all that helpful, etc.? I liked how everybody talked about the need for imagination. Restorative justice what its promise is a more flexible, a more imaginative solution for the problems that plague us interpersonally and communally. And it's at its most promising. It's an ability to think beyond the boxes of traditional crime, harm, punishment, etc. And so that I think is a good step forward. Oh yeah, and nearly everybody brought up impact illustration. That's often been, that's one of the big kind of successes of restorative justice as opposed to the criminal justice scenario. If you think about a court case is very circumscribed. The only thing at issue is the guilt or the innocence of a particular act, right? Did he do it? Did he do it then? And can that be proven? In a court case, nothing else really matters. It can be used usually in a sentencing phase as part of mitigation or something like that. But in terms of the actual outcome of the court case, it doesn't matter. And many restorative justice practitioners suggest that this is one of the central deficiencies of the criminal justice system. It cannot narrate a holistic picture, and it cannot illustrate the impact of the harm that actually occurred on the people that it occurred to and the societies in which they live. And restorative justice promises to be able to help do that a bit better, okay? So the illustration of the impact, I mean, if, just imagining that you were somebody from across one side of the interface who had never heard of what happened to Protestants or Catholics on the other side of the interface. To hear that story of the hurt that happened to them, and to see that refracted through the eyes of people you know in your own community, can be sort of a powerful, the shared experience of grief, etc., the shared experience of pain can be a sort of a very helpful sort of, it's suggested way to sort of improve community relations. That's all I got. Did anybody have any questions for me or for anybody else? And if not, I will let you go. Yeah?
What occurred to me as you were talking there about discussion between the perpetrator and the victim as to what the punishment should be. Maybe we should look at other cultures and see how they deal with it.
Indeed.
For instance, as an extreme in Islam, say somebody commits murder, the victim's relatives can either insist on the death penalty or accept money or forgive.
Right.
And there was a case a few years ago, I think it was in Turkey, where a young man was condemned for murder and he was going to be hanged from a crane. And the family of the victim was left it right to the last minute. The rope was around the guy's neck, they were going to haul him up, and then the main relative of the victim said, okay, that's enough. The guy was terrified, he nearly died of fright at the moment.
That might be a bit extreme as an example, but I take your point.
That's
the
point.
Yeah.
But then, you know, go to even more primitive cultures. And I remember I was in Kenya once, I was out in a tribal area, and there was a case where a man had sex with another man's wife, and the husband had complained, and the tribe gathered, and in a very simple way, there was a stick, and you could only speak when you held that stick.
The talking stick, yeah, that's a big
stick.
Yeah,
and
something that's very associated with restorative
they came to the
justice.
conclusion, they said, right, you, the perpetrator, must support that woman. Should become pregnant, support her through her pregnancy, and support the child for so many years. You know, simple stuff like that.
The one thing that the one issue that I'd call your attention to when we did this original, just to be careful with, is when we talked about the justice community, we talked about a tendency sometimes of restorative justices to fetishize or idealize other cultures. The experience of living in early pre-industrial or early modern cultures is not necessarily directly translatable into the hyper-modern societies in which we live today. That being said, I do agree with you that looking to other cultures, Navajo peacemaking circles, First Americans talking stick practices and things like that can be helpful, as you know that they've done that in New Zealand with the family group conferences and the integration of Maori ritual into the practices as well. But yeah, one caution. Huh? Yeah, John.
Yeah, just really talking about that widening and incentivising, engaging. I think what's happened sometimes here is that, you know, with the carrot and stick, paramilitaries says, oh, you know, we might lift a threat if you engage with this, and there's no danger that that makes restorative justice practitioners in those programs
I would
collaborated.
It does. I would suggest that when you say incentivization, if you're talking about incentivization backed with the threat of violence, implicit or explicit, that's not incentivization. That's coercion. That's what I'd suggest in response to that.
One of the things, Joe, that I find myself asking in this is, if my house was firebombed, what would I want? And so, you know, when there's a part of me can engage with the theory. You know, I've had my house burgled, I've had my car robbed more than once, for example. So if something awful happened, what would I want? And I'm guessing that my first action if my house was firebombed is I would go straight to the police for an investigation of who might have done this. You know, wonderfully, nothing terribly awful like that has happened. But so I'm trying to, I suppose what I'm saying is, there's all the theories there might be, and then what's my instinctual reaction?
Instinctual action is generally survival.
Yeah. And so that's all I want to say. It just.
Of course. And we make a point here, and maybe I'm not going to. Hopefully, this isn't controversial, but that controversial. But we make a point that sometimes, when you have communities that are ruled or policed by actors who seem unjust to certain people, recourse to the institutions of the state has been a way to escape that. So, for women, for example, let's take universities, right, to get us out of Northern Ireland, so I'm not suggesting anything there. But let's take college campuses in the United States, where women, there's an epidemic of sexual assault and rape on college campuses in the United States. If you just read this most recent Rolling Stone article, it will knock your socks off. It will just horrify you regarding the University of Virginia. Women have looked to the university structures that have promised to protect them and been cruelly betrayed for decades in the United States. And as such, recourse to the police or the outside has proven a way to escape the patriarchal structures of that university. So if you scale that to another situation where you have an actor that exerts a system of control over a university or over a community, looking outside of that community, looking outside of the people who provide that protection or force might in fact be more restorative than going to them in the first place. Does that make sense?
Just a final thing. The perpetrator as a victim.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know if we've talked about that they are the product of their community very often. And they're fired with anger at what they perceive as the injustice to their community. How do you handle that? I just throw it out as another.
No, I remember you asking me this question last time, and I didn't have a good answer for it, and I still don't. What we named the Justice's reintegration strand suggests that violence stems from sociological causes. That's what you're talking about. It stems from experiences of deprivation, from humiliation, from living in an unjust social order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't to suggest that poverty causes crime or anything like that, but yeah.
Interestingly, it's not the people enduring poverty, but this is something that is shared, you know. There's nothing like a good cry to cheer you up. You know. There's nothing like a burst of anger to solidify your own self-righteousness. And that's what allows politicians to call one another bastards and toilet paper and so on. So it's not just about the young fella who throws the stone and breaks the window. There's a community.
There's an interesting book by Martha Mino, who's the dean of Harvard Law School on restorative justice, and she it's on a number of things, but she suggests that maybe restorative justice is between vengeance and forgiveness. That's the title of her book, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness. It's somewhere operating in that kind of that vast space there. Yeah.
Flavio.
Yes.
Yeah, Flavio.
I think the problem is the bad distribution of resources, and I think the way the society shifts those resources in the hands of few cause a lot of troubles, and everybody is responsible for a crime committed in one corner of a place, and we're very naive in thinking that punishment has to go down the line of picking up that person that is the perpetrator and that is sorted, because you will get many of them coming back causing the same kind of trouble. These people are lacking of support and connection with society as normally people do, and that's why they're obviously in the place they are.
Yeah, I think you position yourself a bit under what we call the insurgent strand. If you remember the quote that we used in the insurgent strand, it was restoration into what, right? Without into separate relationships, weak family structures, cycles of poverty, violence, etc. And I think that I'm with you on that. There's a real limitation to restorative justice if it's not going at least hand in hand with dealing with the fact that fundamentally we live in unjust socio-political orders.
It's a much bigger picture than the perpetrator.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
I think,
let me get this lady first, then I'll use it.
It says restorative justice. Well, you're looking for justice, but what about the restitution? Do you know?
Exactly.
If you get your car broken into and you have your insurance goes up, who's going to pay for that?
That's an excellent question, and something that always, and that's one of those questions that always needs to be asked when you're talking about restorative justice. What place for restitution?
Restore means restitution.
Reparations.
Yeah,
Exactly.
reparations.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Karen?
I know this is partly due to the event that you asked us to talk about, but I know this kind of this sort of theme throughout every group, which is talking about young people, young people. And it just sort of seems to me that that young people are in a way the sort of least powerful group in society, economically and politically.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's kind of so I think in a restorative justice approach that is framed as a youth oriented thing is in a way kind of just another element of the control of the young that is already.
You identify a real danger there. And what restorative justice promises is that it can help correct those implicit power imbalances, whether that between young people and adults, women and men, minority groups and majority groups. It promises to be a way to do that, right? That's the theory. That's what the theory says. Does it do that in practice? Well, the evidence is not as rosy as all that, and I suggest that one of the dangers of unaccountable or poorly thought out restorative justice is exactly as you say, that it can reify or re-entrench those unequal relationships of power.
Should we wrap it up, folks?
I
think so.
We'll take one more.
I think there's an implication in this exercise that these youngsters are from the lower deprived social classes.
Yeah.
They may not necessarily be so. Yeah. And there are people from the upper classes, middle classes, even higher classes, who, if they don't actually perpetrate a crime, they instigate it. So how do we apply restorative justice there?
That's exactly what I was trying to say before.
Right.
It's almost like more questions than answers.
That's the idea. This is if this thing is ever going to work, it requires people like you asking these type of questions. So Well done.
Listen,
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That's been very interesting, and thank you for staying a little bit longer than our normal 2 o'clock ending. Really appreciate the fact that we were able to get that additional bit of feedback. It's been a great privilege, Joe, to have you for these 2 sessions. Joe will be heading back to the US in a few weeks' time. We're kind of hoping he might come back.
I'll be back for at least a little bit. Yeah, you can't get rid of me that easily.
So, and I know the paper's not totally finished yet.
Nope, but we're going to go back and do another draft.
So will you get him again before he leaves? The next time you're over, we'll have you again. Because I think it's a very interesting topic of conversation, and it's a case of getting a few more people in the room as well, and get and keep the conversation going. And it's been fascinating, and thank you very much.
Thank you all for staying. It's great for me too.
Next week is integrated education, so please come along. Thank you very much.